Sarah Whitmore slammed her last coin onto the wooden table so hard it spun 3 full circles before falling flat, and her 9-year-old son Luke watched it drop with the kind of silence that breaks a mother's heart clean in two. $40. That was everything she had left in this world, and she'd just handed it to Harold Mercer's supply clerk for a booth rental at the Red Creek Summer Fair. A booth nobody would visit. A table nobody would stop at. She already knew. She'd known since the moment she loaded the wagon before sunrise. Her hands shaking not from cold, but from the particular terror of a woman who understands exactly how close the edge is and how little it would take to fall over it. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who used to know your name, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens to Sarah Whitmore on this summer morning in 1887 is the kind of truth that doesn't belong to any one town or any one woman. It belongs to every person who kept showing up long after the world stopped watching. The sun had been up for 3 hours when Sarah set the last pie on the table. She'd baked 7 of them. Apple cinnamon peach preserve and 2 blackberry, the kind that left your fingers stained purple for a day and a half. She'd also brought 2 dozen biscuits, a full pot of beef stew she'd kept warm under a doubled wool blanket during the wagon ride, and 12 cinnamon rolls wrapped individually in brown paper. Because Emily had said firmly, the way 15-year-olds say things when they're trying to sound older than they are, that individually wrapped items looked more professional. People respect presentation. Mama. Emily had said that morning, standing at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, her dark hair pinned back unevenly flour on her forearm. Sarah had looked at her daughter and felt something complicated move through her chest. Pride and grief at the same time mixed up so thoroughly she couldn't separate them anymore. "You're right," she'd said. "Hand me the paper." Now standing behind her booth at the Red Creek Summer Fair. Sarah watched the crowd move through the fairgrounds like water flowing around a stone. They parted before her table without effort, without thought, without even a glance downward at the pies she'd spent the last 2 days preparing. A woman in a yellow dress walked past so close that her skirt hem nearly brushed the front edge of the table. She didn't look up. Mama. Hannah was 12 and had her father's eyes steady, watchful. The kind of eyes that noticed everything and said very little. She was standing just behind Sarah's left shoulder, her voice pitched low. "The Hendersons went to Martha Greer's booth." "I see that. They bought 4 pies." "I know, sweetheart. But your pies are better." Sarah didn't answer. She rearranged the cinnamon rolls instead, moved the front row slightly left, then slightly right, then back to where they'd been, because her hands needed something to do, and her face needed a moment she wasn't willing to let Hannah witness. 3 years. It had been 3 years since Jacob died a horse accident, sudden and senseless, in the way that only truly unfair deaths managed to be. And in those 3 years, Sarah had tried every reasonable thing a widow could try in a town the size of Red Creek, Wyoming. She'd taken in laundry. She'd done mending. She'd baked for the church social twice before Reverend Holt's wife quietly stopped asking. She'd approached the general store about supplying baked goods, and the owner, a thin man named Carver, with the kind of permanent squint that suggested he was always calculating something, had looked her over slowly, all of her from the top of her head to the wide curve of her hips, and said he wasn't sure there was demand. "Demand?" Sarah had repeated. "People are particular," Carver had said. He hadn't met her eyes when he said it. She'd understood exactly what he meant. She'd understood it the same way she understood the whispers she heard at the dry goods store, the way conversations shifted when she walked into the church hall, the particular silence that fell over a table of women whenever she approached. Red Creek was not a cruel town by nature. It was something worse. It was an indifferent one. And indifference, Sarah had learned, had a way of making a person feel like they were already gone. "You going to cry?" Luke appeared beside her, pressing his small body against her hip. He was 9 years old and had recently decided that directness was the highest virtue. He'd gotten that from his father, too. "No," Sarah said. "Your eyes are doing the thing. I'm fine. Pa used to say your eyes did the thing right before you said you were fine." She looked down at him. He was squinting up at her with such earnest concern that she felt the dangerous prickling begin behind her eyes and had to press her lips together hard to stop it. "Go help your sister with the lemonade," she said. "We don't have lemonade." "Then go stand next to her and look useful." Luke considered this, seriously nodded, and went. The morning stretched on. By 10 o'clock, Sarah had sold 2 biscuits to old Clarence Webb, who was mostly deaf and had wandered to her table by accident, and who had paid her with a buffalo nickel and a lengthy story about his late wife's biscuit recipe that he delivered entirely without pausing for breath. By 11, she'd sold nothing else. She watched Tom and Delia Pearson stop at 4 different booths, laughing, buying, handing over coins as easily as breathing, and not once look in her direction. She had $40 left in the world, 39.5 now after paying for this booth. The children needed new shoes before winter. Emily needed a school reader. Her current one had been repaired so many times with glue and careful stitching that half the pages had stiffened into something more like boards. Luke had a cough that hadn't fully cleared since March, and the doctor in Red Creek charged $2 for a consultation, and Sarah had been telling herself for 6 weeks that the cough sounded better. It sounded better. It definitely sounded better. Fresh baked pies. She said it to the passing crowd for the first time. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Cinnamon rolls, beef stew. A man glanced over middle-aged vest buttons, straining, and then glanced away. Fresh baked. Nobody's buying from you, Sarah. She knew that voice. Harold Mercer materialized out of the crowd the way unpleasant things often do suddenly without warning when you are least prepared. He was the kind of man who occupied space with intention, broad shoulders, and expensive hat, and the specific confidence of someone who has never in his life been told no by anyone he needed something from. He ran the Red Creek Merchant Association, served on the town council, and had over the past 2 years extended himself so thoroughly into the town's commercial life that refusing him had become functionally equivalent to refusing Red Creek itself. He stopped in front of her table. He looked at the pies. Then he looked at her. "I heard you put your last savings into this booth," he said. His tone was conversational, the tone of a man who wants you to understand that what he is saying is not personal, just accurate. "That true? What I do with my money is my own business, Mr. Mercer." "Sure it is." He picked up one of the wrapped cinnamon rolls, turned it over in his hand, set it back down. "I'm just saying, there's practical things to consider. 3 children, no husband, and..." He paused, and the pause was doing work the way his pauses always did work. "Well, you know how people are. They like things a certain way." Sarah held his gaze. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her. She could feel the rough wood grain under her palms. "I know exactly how people are," she said. Something moved in Mercer's eyes, surprised maybe that she hadn't looked down yet. Then it smoothed back out. "Right." He tipped his hat, slightly more reflex than respect. "Good luck to you." He walked away into the crowd, and 2 women nearby who had been watching the exchange suddenly found other directions to look. Emily appeared at Sarah's elbow. "What did he want?" "Nothing." "Mama, I wanted nothing, Emily. Help me adjust the stew pot, the handle's listing left." By noon, the fairgrounds were at full capacity. The sound of the crowd rolled over Sarah's booth in waves, laughter music from the fiddle player. Near the east gate, children shouting the particular percussion of a prosperous summer afternoon in a small western town. And Sarah's table sat at the edge of all of it, like something the tide kept missing. She had sold 4 biscuits total. One of the pies had been jostled when a passing child ran into the table corner, leaving a small dent in the crust. Hannah had carefully smoothed it back, but it still showed if you looked. Sarah was close. She could feel it. The specific internal threshold that once crossed could not be uncrossed. The moment when the accumulated weight of everything becomes too heavy to keep pretending it isn't. Her throat was tight. Her feet hurt. She'd been awake since 3 in the morning, and she hadn't eaten today because the food on this table represented money, and she would not eat money. "Excuse me." She almost didn't look up. "Ma'am." It was the voice that made her look. Not loud, not commanding, just direct. The voice of someone who was speaking specifically to her and meant to be heard. How was leaning against the front of her table with one arm looking at the pies. Taller than she'd expected, when her eyes traveled upward from the worn brown leather of his boots to the sun-darkened forearms, crossed over the table edge, to a face that was weathered and lean, and carrying the particular tiredness of a man who has been working hard at something for a long time with uncertain results. Dark eyes. Dark hat brim tipped forward against the afternoon sun. A shirt that had been good once and was still clean, which told her something about him. "These yours?" He gestured at the table. "They are," Sarah said. "All of it. Every piece." He straightened up and looked at the full table, the pies, the biscuits, the wrapped rolls, the stew still warm in its pot. "That's a lot of cooking for a summer morning," he said. "I've been up since 3. He looked at her then. Not the way most men in this town looked at her, with the sliding kind of glance that arrived at a conclusion before it had traveled the full distance. He looked at her the way you look at someone whose face is telling you something you want to understand. "I'll take one of those rolls," he said. He reached into his vest pocket. "How much?" 5 cents. He put a dime on the table. "Keep the change." She handed him the roll. He unwrapped it right there, standing at her table, and took a bite. She watched him. She didn't mean to. She had trained herself in these 3 years not to watch people's faces when they ate her food, because hope was expensive and she could not afford it. But she watched him. He went still. Not the polite stillness of a man constructing a compliment. Real stillness, the kind that means something has stopped you. He took another bite, chewed slowly, swallowed. He looked at the table, then at her. "Ma'am," he said, "who taught you to cook?" "My grandmother," Sarah said. "And then myself." "How long have you been selling out of this booth?" "Since this morning." "And how much have you sold?" She almost didn't answer. It was a personal question from a stranger, and the honest answer was humiliating. "Not enough," she said. He looked at the table again. He looked at the crowd moving past, the easy, comfortable crowd that had been walking past her all morning like she was a fence post or a shadow. "What's the stew?" he asked. "Beef. Carrots, potatoes, my own seasoning blend. It's been warm since 7 this morning." "It smelled this good all morning." "I believe so." He nodded slowly. He finished the cinnamon roll. He folded the brown paper wrapper neatly and put it in his vest pocket, not dropped on the ground, not left on her table pocketed, and she noticed that too. "I'll take the rest," he said. Sarah blinked. "I'm sorry." "The pies, the biscuits, the stew, the rolls. How many you got left?" 11 rolls, 6 pies, 16 biscuits, most of the stew." "What's that run?" She did the arithmetic in her head fast, the way she'd learned to do everything fast and accurate in the last 3 years, because mistakes were not something she had the margin to recover from. $6.40 for everything. He reached into his inside jacket pocket. He produced a fold of bills. He counted out $7 and placed them on the table with the same unhurried deliberateness he'd placed the dime. "Keep the change," he said again. Sarah stared at the money, then at him. "I can't take." "You're not taking anything," he said. "You earned it. Those are the best biscuits I've eaten in 4 years, and I grew up with a cook who would have wept to taste that cinnamon roll. So that's a transaction, ma'am, not a favor." He started loading the pies carefully, 2 at a time, into the crate he'd apparently brought over from somewhere. And Sarah realized, watching him work with practiced efficiency, that he had been intending to do this before he even reached the table. He'd assessed the situation while walking over. He'd come prepared. "I don't know your name," she said. "Ethan Walker." He didn't stop loading. "I run the Broken Horn Ranch about 8 miles north. You know it." "I know of it. I've got 11 hands in a cook situation that's been a problem since March." He paused, holding a pie. "I don't suppose you're looking for work." The fairgrounds noise continued around them. Fiddles and laughter, and the confident sounds of an ordinary summer afternoon. Emily had gone completely still at the lemonade-free end of the table watching. Hannah had one hand pressed flat against her sternum, the way she held herself when she was trying not to react to something. Luke was staring at Ethan Walker with the unguarded assessment that only a 9-year-old can get away with. Sarah looked at the $7 on her table. Then she looked at Ethan Walker, who was waiting for her answer with the easy patience of a man who was genuinely asking and not already certain of the answer. "I have 3 children," she said. "I saw. They'd have to come with me. Ranch has room. I don't make decisions quickly." "That's sensible," he said. He set the last pie in the crate and straightened up. "Come out and have a look at the place before you decide. No obligation." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small card plain, just his name and the ranch name and a rough directional note. "If you decide it's not for you, no harm done." He picked up the crate. "But ma'am," he said, and his voice dropped slightly, not lower in volume, but in register something more genuine beneath the transaction. "You've been standing at this table since 3 in the morning, cooking food that would make a grown man reconsider his choices, and this whole town walked past you. That's not a reflection of your worth. That's a reflection of their blindness." He tipped his hat. He walked away into the crowd with her entire remaining inventory in a wooden crate, and Sarah stood at her empty table with $7 and a small card in her hand. And Emily was already at her shoulder asking who that was, and what did he say, and what did he mean about a ranch, Mama? What did he mean? And Luke was saying he liked him. He looked like he knew about horses, and Hannah was still very still and very quiet, but she was smiling. Sarah looked down at the card. She looked at the empty table. She looked at her 3 children. And something shifted very slightly, like the first almost imperceptible change in wind direction before a storm that will change everything. She drove out to the Broken Horn Ranch 2 days later. She told herself it was just a look. Just a look, nothing decided, nothing promised, and if anything felt wrong, she would turn the wagon around before she'd even climb down from the seat. She'd made that clear to Emily, who had spent the 2 days since the fair in a state of barely contained excitement that Sarah found both touching and alarming. She'd made it clear to Hannah, who had asked precisely 4 careful questions, and then gone quiet in the way that meant she was processing. She had not made it clear to Luke, because Luke had already decided the answer was yes, and nothing Sarah said was going to interfere with that conclusion. "He had good boots," Luke said from the wagon seat beside her, as if this settled the matter entirely. "Boots don't tell you everything about a man," Sarah said. "Pa had good boots." She didn't answer that. The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, and Sarah pulled the wagon to a slow stop without meaning to, just for a moment, just to look. It was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected exactly, but the Broken Horn was working land in a way that showed not grand, not prosperous in any obvious sense, but real. Solid. The kind of place where things got fixed when they broke, and where the people living there had decided somewhere along the way to stay. Ethan Walker was coming out of the barn when she pulled into the yard, and he saw her before she'd climbed down, and he didn't make a production of it. Didn't come rushing over, didn't perform surprise or welcome. He just walked toward the wagon at an ordinary pace and said, "Glad you came," and meant it simply. "I haven't decided anything," Sarah said. "I know." He looked at the children. "You want to look at the kitchen first, or the bunkhouse arrangements?" "Kitchen." He nodded and led them in. The kitchen was a disaster, not filthy. Someone had made effort recently, probably in anticipation of her visit, but the arrangement was wrong in a dozen ways that told her everything about why they'd been struggling since March. The stove was positioned so that whoever worked it had their back to the only work table, meaning every task required turning. The dry goods were stored in a pattern that made no logical sense, flour behind the salt behind the lard, all of it requiring excavation. The pot rack was hung at a height that would be comfortable for a man of about 6 feet and punishing for anyone else. "How many men are you feeding?" she asked. 11 plus myself. 3 meals. Breakfast and dinner. Midday they're out. What happened to your last cook? Ethan was quiet for a moment. He left in March. Personal reasons. Gave me 2 days' notice. And since then, I've been doing it myself. He paused. I am not a cook. She looked at the stove. She looked at the work table. She walked to the window, assessed the light turned back. The stove needs to move, she said. All right? And the shelving needs to be completely reorganized. All right? I'll want to know every man's dietary restrictions before I plan the first week of meals. Ethan looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. So you're deciding. I'm listing conditions, she said. I haven't decided. But she had. She knew it, and he probably knew it, and Emily definitely knew it, because Emily was already standing at the work table, running her hand along the edge, with the focused expression of someone mentally calculating how much better this could be. The thing that decided her the actual moment, though she wouldn't admit it to anyone for weeks, was not the kitchen, and not the space, and not the $7 still sitting in her apron pocket. It was one of the ranch hands. His name was Pete Dawson. He was somewhere between 45 and 60, weathered past the point where age was easy to read, and he'd been watching them from the bunkhouse doorway since they arrived. When Luke walked too close to the fence line, near the horse paddock, Pete was there in 4 steps, not grabbing, not alarming, just positioning himself between the boy and the fence, with the ease of someone who'd done it 100 times before. Fence has a loose board on the bottom, Pete said to Luke, matter of fact. Horse gets his leg caught in that gap, bad day for everybody. Luke looked up at him with complete seriousness. I would have seen it. Sure you would have, Pete said. But now you saw it faster. Luke thought about this and decided it was acceptable. You got a horse that's yours. Roan mare Enstall. Name's June. Can I see her? Pete looked at Sarah. She nodded. He looked at Luke. Stay on this side of the gate. Yes, sir. Sarah watched her son walk toward the barn alongside this stranger and felt the complicated calculus of trust, the risk of it, the cost of withholding it, the particular exhaustion of doing everything alone for 3 years. The first week was harder than she'd expected. Not the cooking. The cooking she could do in her sleep, had done in her sleep, the rhythm of it as natural as breathing. It was the men, not because they were unkind. They weren't. But she was a woman in a working ranch kitchen, which meant she was something none of them quite knew how to categorize, and there was a period of adjustment that involved a lot of careful silence and a few spectacularly awkward moments. The first morning she set breakfast on the table. Eggs, biscuits, thick-cut bacon gravy she'd made from the drippings with a pinch of the spice blend she carried in her own tin. 11 men sat down and ate without a word. Not rude silence. Stunned silence. It was a hand named Calloway Younger, maybe 25, with the kind of easy laugh that made other people relax, who broke it. Ma'am, he said, I want you to know that what I just ate is the single best thing that has happened to me since I fell off a horse in Cheyenne and landed in a snowbank, and the snowbank was already an improvement over what Walker had been feeding us. Laughter broke around the table. Even Ethan at the head of it pressed his mouth together in a way that wasn't quite suppressing a smile. I'll take that as a compliment, Sarah said. It is one, Calloway said. Ma'am, it is genuinely one. Within 3 days, the dynamic had shifted. Not dramatically, there was no single moment of transformation. It was accumulated small things. Pete, teaching Luke the proper way to hold a hammer. Hannah bringing biscuits to the afternoon work crew without being asked and being thanked with such genuine surprise that she'd come back to the kitchen, pink-cheeked and quiet in the good way. Emily discovering that the ranch's account ledger was being kept in a method that was charitably speaking creative, and offering to reorganize it with such careful confidence that Ethan had said yes before he'd fully thought it through. And then there was the morning. Sarah overheard 2 of the hands talking outside the kitchen window. She hadn't meant to listen. She was at the stove and the window was open for the heat and their voices carried. Heard she lost everything when her husband died, one of them said. It was a voice she didn't recognize immediately, one of the newer men, Greer, or maybe Torres. Left her with those 3 kids and nothing, the other confirmed. She ain't a pause. She ain't what I expected when Walker said he'd hired a widow with children. What did you expect? A longer pause. I don't know. Someone sadder, maybe. Sarah stood at her stove and did not move for a moment. She ain't sad, the first voice said. She's... He seemed to be searching for the word. She's the kind of tired that looks like strong, you know. Yeah, the other said. Yeah, I know that kind. She moved the pan off the heat and stood very still and breathed. By the end of the second week, the ranch had changed in ways that were hard to quantify, but impossible to miss. The men came to meals on time. Conversation at the table had returned real conversation, the kind that builds something between people over shared food. Pete had started teaching Luke to write an arrangement that had apparently begun as a casual offer and solidified without discussion into a daily lesson. Hannah had started bringing a book to the kitchen in the late afternoon and sitting at the corner of the work table while Sarah prepped supper, and they talked easily, unexpectedly, in the way that women sometimes find a rhythm together without quite deciding to. Emily had reorganized the ranch accounts into a system that Ethan described with visible bewilderment as comprehensible for the first time in 4 years. Ethan himself was a problem that Sarah was not ready to examine directly. How was present in the way that competent, serious people are present, not intrusive, not demanding, but there. He checked in on the kitchen without hovering. He thanked her for meals directly and specifically, not the blanket performative gratitude of a man executing a social obligation, but the particular acknowledgement of someone who had been doing without and understood the difference. He treated her children with an undemonstrative, consistent care that made her chest ache in a way she was not going to think about yet. On the 15th day, he came into the kitchen at noon and found her sitting at the work table with her eyes closed and her hands flat on the surface and her head slightly bowed, not praying, not sleeping, just stopped. She heard him come in and didn't move. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Breakfast." "It's noon." "I know when it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him at the stove, heard the sound of the pot, the ladle. "You cook for 12 people 3 times a day," he said, "and you forget to feed yourself." "I don't forget," she said. She opened her eyes. He set a bowl in front of her, her own stew from the supper pot she'd started that morning. "I just run out of the appetite for it sometimes." He sat down across from her. "When Jacob died," he said, and he used her husband's name with a care that surprised her, not avoiding it, not tiptoeing, just using it. "How long before you stopped eating like that?" She picked up the spoon. "About a month." "How'd it stop?" "Luke got sick. I couldn't afford to be running on empty anymore." She paused. "He needed me." Ethan nodded. "They need you," he said. "But you're also allowed to eat." It was such a simple thing to say. She almost laughed. She took a spoonful of the stew instead, and the familiar taste of her own cooking hit her in the chest, the way it always did when she hadn't eaten that particular relief of the body that had been waiting longer than she'd acknowledged. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Ethan." "Ethan." She tested the name. It fit in her mouth without resistance. "Why did you really buy everything on my table that day?" I was quiet for a moment, not evasive thinking. "Because the cinnamon roll was extraordinary," he said. "That's true, but..." He paused. He looked at the work table surface. "I'd been watching that booth since 10 in the morning." She went still. "I'd seen the whole town walk past it," he said. "I'd seen that man Mercer stop and say something to you that made your hands go flat on the table." He looked at her directly. "I know what it looks like when a person is deciding whether to keep going. I've been that person." The kitchen was very quiet. "What kept you going?" Sarah asked. Something moved across his face, complicated, old. "My father left this ranch to me when it was half what it is now," he said. 6 years ago, I was 3 bad seasons away from losing it. Nobody in this county wanted to extend credit to a rancher whose cattle numbers were down. I sat in this kitchen." He stopped. "I sat right there where you're sitting, and I thought about walking away." "What stopped you?" "Pete Dawson," he said. "He came in and put a plate of food in front of me. Terrible food because Pete cannot cook to save his life. God bless him. He sat across from me and said, 'You gonna eat that?' And I ate it. And the next morning I got up and went to work." Sarah looked at him. "Sometimes," he said, "someone just needs to sit across from you and make you eat." She looked down at her bowl. She took another spoonful. Outside the kitchen window, she could hear Luke in the yard calling to Pete with the specific high-pitched enthusiasm of a boy who has been given access to horses and finds this to be an entirely adequate substitute for nearly everything else that had been missing from his life. She could hear Emily's voice somewhere near the barn, maybe explaining something with the brisk confidence of someone who has recently become the expert on accounts and is not going to pretend otherwise. She couldn't hear Hannah, but Hannah's quiet was a different quality than it had been when they arrived, less watchful, more settled. She finished the bowl. "I want to talk about the summer supply situation," she said. "Your arrangement with Carver's General Store is overpriced by about 30%, and there's a farm cooperative 2 counties over that sells direct." Ethan blinked. "I know that because Carver was charging the same inflated rates when I tried to supply baked goods last year," she said. "He runs a captive market and he knows it. But he doesn't know I've been corresponding with the cooperative about pricing." "You've been?" "I've been here 2 weeks," she said. "I don't sit still." She looked at him steadily. "If you want to cut your food costs by a third, I can show you exactly how." Ethan Walker sat across from her at the kitchen table, where he had once sat alone and thought about giving up. And he looked at this woman who had been up since 3 in the morning twice a week for 3 years, and who had sat down at his table, not because she had no options, but because she had chosen this one, and something in his face shifted slow, careful like a man who has learned to be cautious about things that matter. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. What neither of them acknowledged in that kitchen, in that ordinary noon hour, with the sound of children in the yard, and the stew pot warm on the stove, was that something had quietly and irrevocably changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way certain things change, like the moment the light shifts in late afternoon, and you look up and realize without being able to identify exactly when it happened, that the day has turned toward evening. And in the town of Red Creek, 8 miles south, Harold Mercer was hearing things. Things about the widow at the Broken Horn Ranch. Things about how the ranch hands were talking. Things about how travelers on the North Road were stopping at the ranch to ask if there was food available, and leaving satisfied. He was sitting in his office when his clerk, a young man named Willis, said carefully, "Seems like Walker's operation is picking up." Mercer turned his pen over in his hand. "Is it?" he said. Willis cleared his throat. "The widow's cooking, they say. People are talking about it." Mercer looked at the wall. "People," he said, "talk about all kinds of things." He set the pen down with a precise, deliberate click. "Doesn't mean they're talking about the right things." Willis didn't say anything. "Find out." Mercer said, "Who her suppliers are, who she's been talking to, who's buying." Willis nodded and left. Mercer sat alone in his office and looked at the wall and thought about a woman who had stood at a table in the summer heat and not looked down when he'd expected her to. He did not like what he was thinking. The first rumor reached Sarah on a Tuesday. She heard it from Hannah, which was the worst possible way to hear it, because Hannah had her father's eyes and her father's habit of delivering difficult information with a stillness that made it land harder than shouting would have. Hannah had gone into Red Creek with Pete Dawson to pick up a supply order flour salt. The particular dried beans that Calloway had mentioned were the only ones he could eat without consequence. A detail Sarah had filed away without comment, because that was the kind of cook she was. They'd been at the general store when Mrs. Tillman, the seamstress, had said something to the woman beside her in what was probably meant to be a low voice, but wasn't. "That Whitmore woman's got her claws in Walker good, they say. Using those children like a stage prop. Man doesn't know what's hit him." Hannah told Sarah this at the kitchen table that evening, sitting straight-backed with her hands folded, delivering it the way you deliver a report, clean, factual, stripped of performance. But her jaw was tight and her knuckles were white, and Sarah recognized both. "Who else was in the store?" Sarah asked. 4 other women. They all heard. "What did Pete say?" Hannah's expression shifted slightly. He turned around and said, "Ma'am, I've worked for Ethan Walker for 11 years, and I've eaten his cooking for 6 months. That woman saved this ranch's morale in 2 weeks flat. And if you'd like to discuss using children as stage props, I'd suggest you try raising 3 of them alone for 3 years first." Then he paid for the supplies and we left. Sarah sat with that for a moment. "Good for Pete," she said. "Mama." Hannah unfolded her hands and pressed them flat on the table, the same gesture Sarah made without knowing she'd passed it on. "It's going to get worse, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. Hannah was 12 years old, and she already knew the answer. "Probably," Sarah said. "Are we leaving?" Sarah looked at her daughter. At the steadiness in her and the fear underneath it, both real, both present, neither one winning. No, she said. Hannah nodded once. She picked up her book and went to her corner of the work table, and the subject was closed. It got worse. By the following week, the rumor had evolved, the way rumors do in small towns. Each retelling, adding something, subtracting something, until the thing being passed around bears only a structural resemblance to whatever it started as. The new version held that Sarah had approached Ethan at the fair, specifically because she'd known he was struggling financially, that the whole encounter had been calculated, that the children were, as Mrs. Tillman had put it, a stage prop deployed to appeal to a lonely man's sympathies. Sarah heard this version from Calloway, who delivered it with visible fury, and the air of a man who had been physically restraining himself from saying something about it in town for 3 days. "It's Mercer," Calloway said. He wasn't being quiet about it. They were in the kitchen, and 3 other hands were eating breakfast, and none of them were pretending not to listen. "He's the one putting it around. Willis, his clerk, told my cousin that Mercer's been asking questions about you since the week after you got here. Where you buy supplies, who you've been talking to, whether Walker's named you in any business dealings." Sarah set down the pan she was holding. "Why would he care about the supply arrangements?" she asked, though she already had a theory. "Because you went around Carver," Pete said from the end of the table. He was eating with the focused economy of a man who had opinions and was choosing his moment. "Carver and Mercer are tight. Carver overcharges every ranch in this county, and Mercer facilitates it. You went to the cooperative 2 counties over, and Walker's food costs dropped 30%. That cuts into an arrangement they've had for years." The table was quiet. "She's a threat," Emily said. Everyone looked at her. She was standing in the doorway to the pantry where she'd been doing the morning accounts, and she said it the way she said most things, plainly, as if she'd simply finished calculating and was now reporting the result. "Mercer doesn't care about the rumors for their own sake," Emily said. "He cares because if the rumors work, we leave. If we leave, Walker goes back to Carver for supplies. It's money." She was 15 years old. The table was very quiet. "That's exactly right," Ethan said from the doorway. He'd come in during Calloway's speech, and Sarah hadn't heard him. He was looking at Emily with an expression she'd seen him use on the hands when one of them solved a problem efficiently. Not praise exactly, more like acknowledgement. Respect without condescension. "So we don't leave," Calloway said. "We don't leave," Ethan confirmed. He looked at Sarah. She looked back at him. "He'll escalate," she said. "He will," Ethan agreed. "Are you ready for that?" He didn't answer immediately. Not because he was uncertain, but because he was being honest, giving the question its weight before he answered it. "Are you?" he asked back. She picked up the pan. "I've been ready for 3 years," she said. "I just didn't have anyone standing next to me." Mercer's escalation arrived faster than Sarah had estimated, and with more coordination than she'd expected, which told her he'd been planning it before the supply situation, possibly from the moment he'd seen her at the fair, standing at her table, with her hands flat and not looking down. The first move was the suppliers. The feed merchant in Red Creek, a man named Hobbs, who had always been cordial to Ethan without being warm, sent a note saying he could no longer guarantee delivery to the Broken Horn on the previous schedule. He was sorry for any inconvenience. No further explanation. Ethan read the note at breakfast, set it on the table, and looked at Pete. "Mercer," Pete said. "Mercer," Ethan confirmed. "Hobbs has owed him money since the winter of '84, Pete said. Not cash debt, the other kind. Favor debt, the kind that got called in quietly and paid without paperwork. We'll source from Clayton," Sarah said. Both men looked at her. "It's 12 miles farther, and the price per hundredweight is 4 cents higher. But Frank Clayton doesn't owe Harold Mercer anything, because they had a public dispute at the town council in March of '86 over the water rights on the South Fork. I know because Jacob used to say Clayton was the only merchant in the county Mercer hadn't gotten to yet." Ethan looked at her steadily. "You've been thinking about this." "I think about everything," she said. "It's how I've stayed alive." They switched to Clayton within the week. Mercer's second move came 3 days later, a piece in the Red Creek Courier. Not a direct attack. Something more careful than that. A small notice, 4 sentences in the community correspondence section, unsigned. noting that certain recent changes in the area's commercial arrangements had prompted questions among longtime business owners about the influence of outside parties on established relationships. It was the kind of thing that meant everything and proved nothing. Emily read it aloud at breakfast. Her voice was flat and controlled, and when she finished, there was a silence around the table that had teeth in it. "Outside parties," Calloway said. "That's her," Luke said. He was at the end of the table, and he said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 9-year-old who has been listening to adult conversations long enough to understand subtext. "They mean Mama." Nobody corrected him. "Outside parties," Pete said slowly. He set down his fork. "I've been in this county for 22 years. Walker's been here all his life. Calloway, how long?" 8 years. Torres. 11. "Every one of us is outside something to somebody if that's the game they want to play," Pete said. He picked his fork back up. "Pass the biscuits." It was the most political speech Sarah had ever heard Pete Dawson make, and it was delivered entirely while focused on his breakfast plate, and she had to turn back to the stove so nobody saw her face. But the piece in the Courier worked the way these things work, not dramatically, not all at once, but through accumulation. 2 ranchers who had been considering buying beef stock from Ethan that season sent polite notes saying they'd decided to wait. A woman Sarah had begun a tentative supply arrangement with selling preserved goods to her hotel kitchen, went quiet and stopped returning messages. The travelers who had been stopping at the ranch road to buy food directly kept coming, but 2 of the hands reported overhearing comments in town. The careful kind of comment delivered just loudly enough to be heard about the propriety of a widow woman running what amounted to a roadside business out of a bachelor rancher's kitchen. Propriety. That was the word they kept using. Sarah was scrubbing the breakfast pots on the Thursday of the 3rd week when she heard Emily's voice outside the kitchen higher than usual, and then a voice she didn't recognize, and she was through the door before she'd decided to move. A man on horseback. Young, maybe 30, maybe less, wearing a town suit that didn't fit the ranch setting. Holding his hat in one hand, with the careful formality of someone delivering something unpleasant, who wants to be able to say afterward that he'd been polite about it. Emily was standing between him and the kitchen door. Her arms were crossed, her chin was up. "I was asking for Mr. Walker," the man said when Sarah appeared. He looked relieved to see an adult, and then not relieved when he registered Sarah's expression. "Mr. Walker is in the south pasture," Sarah said. "I'm the ranch cook. What's your business?" He cleared his throat. "I have a message from Mr. Mercer." "Give it to me." A flicker of hesitation. "It's addressed to—" "Mr. Walker is in the south pasture," Sarah said again. "I'm here. Give it to me." He gave it to her. She opened it right there in front of him and Emily, which she could tell made him uncomfortable, and which she did deliberately. The letter was formal, almost lawyerly in its phrasing. Something about long-standing community standards, about the concern of several prominent citizens for the welfare of the Walker Ranch and its reputation, about the unfortunate situation that had arisen as a result of certain recent staffing decisions, and about how Mercer, as a friend to the Walker family for many years, was prepared to assist in finding a more suitable arrangement for the widow and her children. There was a figure at the bottom. Money. A sum that was meant to look like generosity and functioned when you read it clearly as an offer to make her disappear. Sarah read it twice. Then she folded it precisely and looked at the young man on horseback. "Tell Mr. Mercer," she said, "that I've read his letter and I understand its meaning." "And?" the man said. "And that's my answer," she said. "I understand its meaning." He waited. She didn't add anything. He put his hat back on, turned his horse and rode away, and Sarah watched him go with the letter folded in her hand, and something cold and clear settling into the center of her chest. Emily was looking at her. "What was the number?" Sarah told her. Emily's eyes went wide, then narrowed. "He's scared," she said. "Yes," Sarah said. "Scared people do desperate things." "Yes," Sarah said again. She went back inside and put the letter in the tin box on the shelf where she kept important documents. Not to hide it, to keep it. The town meeting was scheduled for the last Friday of the month, a regular Red Creek Council meeting, the kind that nobody much attended unless there was something specific to argue about. But this one had drawn a crowd that spilled out the front doors of the town hall and onto the board steps, because word had gotten around that Harold Mercer intended to raise the question of commercial licensing requirements for food vendors operating in the county. A new proposal, quite sudden, that would require permits, fees, and approval from the Merchant Association for anyone selling prepared food from private property. Everyone in that room knew what it was about. It was about Sarah Whitmore. It was about the travelers stopping on the North Road. It was about the cooperative arrangement and Carver's lost revenue and the letter that had come back unanswered. Sarah arrived with Ethan and Pete and Calloway and Emily, who had asked to come with the formal gravity of someone who intended to observe proceedings and was not going to be told no. Hannah was at the ranch with Torres watching Luke, and Sarah had hugged her son twice before leaving and told herself it was fine. It was a town meeting. People raised concerns at town meetings. This was how things got handled. Mercer was at the front of the room when they entered, and he watched them come in without expression. Willis stood beside him with a folder. Two of the town council members, both men who ran businesses on the main street, sat at the council table with the carefully neutral faces of people who had already decided but didn't want to perform that decision until they were required to. A third council member, a woman named Agnes Holt, who ran the dry goods store and who had been on the Red Creek Town Council for 14 years, looked at Sarah when she entered and gave her a small nod. Just a nod. Just acknowledgement. But Sarah noticed. Mercer rose when the meeting was called to order and presented his licensing proposal with the smooth authority of a man who had rehearsed it and believed the rehearsal sufficient. He used words like community standards, regulatory consistency, level playing field. He cited vaguely concerns raised by established merchants. He did not say Sarah's name. He didn't have to. When he finished, he sat down and the room was quiet, and Sarah felt every person in that room performing the same calculation, the one between what they believed and what it cost them to say it. Then Ethan Walker stood up. He wasn't a man who spoke in public often. Sarah knew that. The hands had told her not in so many words, but in the way they paid attention when he said anything. The quality of attention given to someone whose words are weighted because they arrive infrequently. He stood up, and he didn't have any papers, and he didn't look at Mercer. He looked at the room. "I'm going to say something true," he said. "And I'm going to say it once, and every person in here is going to have to decide what they do with it." The room was completely still. "3 months ago, my ranch was struggling," he said. "My men's morale was down. My costs were up. I was losing the kind of money that over a season turns into a decision about whether to keep going." He paused. Sarah Whitmore changed that. Not because she maneuvered anything. Not because she had an angle. Because she is the finest cook I have encountered in my adult life, and she runs a kitchen with more competence and more dignity than any operation I've seen in this county. My men eat better. They work better. Travelers stop because the food is exceptional. I am paying less for supplies because she identified an arrangement that serves this ranch honestly. He let that sit. "This proposal tonight is not about licensing," he said. "Everyone in this room knows it, and I am asking every person sitting here to ask themselves what they actually know about this woman versus what they've been told by someone with a financial interest in her leaving." Mercer's face had gone very still. "She was at the summer fair," Ethan continued, "with everything she had left in the world on a table, and this town walked past her. She didn't ask anybody for anything. She got up at 3 in the morning and she cooked and she showed up." He looked at the council table. "I'm asking this council to vote no on this proposal. And I'm asking this town to start seeing clearly." He sat down. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Agnes Holt spoke first. "I'll be voting no," she said. Her voice was dry and certain. "And I'd like to add that I tried Mrs. Whitmore's peach preserve 6 weeks ago, when one of the Broken Horn hands brought some to town, and if anyone here wants to talk about licensing the finest preserved goods in Wyoming, I'll be first in line to buy one." Quiet laughter moved through the room. Not performative, real. Mercer stood. His face was composed, but his hands on the table in front of him were not. "I want to point out that the council is going to vote," Agnes Holt said pleasantly. "That's what councils do." The vote was 3-2 against the proposal. The 2 votes for it were the men at the table who ran Main Street businesses. Agnes Holt and 2 others voted no. The meeting was over. Outside on the steps, Calloway let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for 45 minutes. Pete pulled his hat down. Emily stood beside Sarah and didn't say anything, but she took her mother's hand once, and then released it, which was more than enough. Mercer came out behind them. He didn't stop. He walked past them toward his horse and carriage, but he looked at Sarah as he passed a long and level look, and she held it without flinching. And she saw in his face not the satisfaction of a man who had lost gracefully, but the calculation of one who was not finished. She watched him ride away down the main street of Red Creek, and she knew with the certainty of a woman who had been surviving other people's decisions about her worth for 3 years that tonight was not the end of anything. It was a pause, and on the ride back to the Broken Horn, Ethan's shoulder was 3 inches from hers on the wagon seat, and neither of them moved to close the distance, and neither of them moved to widen it, and the stars over Wyoming were very bright, and neither of them said a word about any of it, and that silence meant more than either of them was ready to name. The pause lasted 11 days. Sarah counted them. Not obsessively, she was too busy for obsession up before dawn, managing a kitchen that now fed 12 men 3 times a day, plus an irregular stream of travelers who had started arriving at the ranch road with the specific purposefulness of people who had heard something and come to verify it with their own mouths. She counted the days, the way she counted everything practically as information. 11 days since the town meeting. 11 days since Mercer had ridden down the main street of Red Creek, with that calculation still running behind his eyes. 11 days of nothing, which was not the same as 11 days of peace. She knew the difference. The break came on a Wednesday morning, and it came through Emily, and it came in a way that Sarah had not predicted, which bothered her more than the thing itself. Emily had gone to the post office in Red Creek to collect the ranch correspondence, a task she'd taken on 3 weeks ago, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had identified a gap and filled it without being asked. She came back an hour earlier than expected, came through the kitchen door without her usual composed entrance, and set a folded document on the work table in front of Sarah with both hands like she was setting down something heavier than paper. It was posted on the notice board outside the courthouse, Emily said. Her voice was careful in the way that meant she was managing something. 3 copies. 1 there, 1 at the general store, 1 at the church. Why? Sarah looked at the document. It was a formal notice, the kind produced by someone with access to legal stationery and the knowledge of how official things were supposed to look. The heading read, Notice of Debt Claim, Broken Horn Ranch. The body alleged that Ethan Walker had defaulted on a commercial loan originating in 1884, that the creditor had exercised patience in the matter for 5 years, and that in light of recent changes to the ranch's operations and personnel, that word, personnel, sitting there doing Mercer's dirty work for him, the creditor was now formally calling the debt due. The creditor was listed as the Red Creek Commercial and Agricultural Fund. Sarah had never heard of the Red Creek Commercial and Agricultural Fund. She read the document twice. Then she said, "Get Ethan." Emily was already gone before she finished the sentence. Ethan read it standing at the work table, not sitting, which told her how he was receiving it, before his face told her anything. He read it once. Then he set it down with a precision that was the controlled version of something else entirely. "This debt doesn't exist," he said. "You're certain? I paid every commercial loan on this property by 1886. I have the receipts." His jaw was tight. "I have the receipts because my father told me when I was 17 years old that a man who doesn't keep his receipts deserves what happens to him." "Then what is the Red Creek Commercial and Agricultural Fund?" "I have no idea." Pete appeared in the doorway. He'd been in the barn and had dirt on his hands and the look of someone who had heard raised voices and come to assess without being called. He looked at the document. He looked at Ethan. "Mercer's been on the county financial board since '82, Pete said. "That fund, I don't know it, but I know the county keeps discretionary agricultural accounts that don't get much public attention. Willis handles filings for half the businesses in town. He's got access to records going back 20 years. The room absorbed this. "He fabricated it," Calloway said. He'd come in behind Pete. Nobody had sent for Calloway either but the Broken Horn Kitchen. had over the past weeks developed the quality of a place where people gathered when something needed to be faced, and Calloway had apparently internalized this. Or he found something old and misrepresented it, Emily said. She was at the far end of the work table with the ranch ledger open and her finger moving down a column. Ethan in 84, was there any financial arrangement with the county board? Anything small? An equipment loan? A seasonal credit line? Ethan was quiet for 3 seconds. The kind of quiet that means something is being remembered. There was a county equipment program in 83, he said slowly. Small loan, $30 for a new fence line post driver. I paid it back inside 6 months. Emily looked up. Do you have that receipt? It's in the property files. Find it today, she said. She said it to Ethan Walker, who was 34 years old and owned this ranch, with the direct authority of someone who understood that the situation required clarity, faster than it required hierarchy. And Ethan didn't blink. He went to find the receipt. Sarah stood in the kitchen after the others dispersed to their tasks and held very still for a moment. This was the part she'd known was coming. Not this specific shape of it, she hadn't predicted a fabricated debt notice, but this quality of it. The escalation past social pressure into something with legal teeth. Mercer had watched the town meeting not work the way he'd needed it to, and he had moved to the next instrument. And the next instrument was a document that looked official, and named a number, and was posted publicly in 3 places, so that everyone in Red Creek would see it before Ethan Walker even knew it existed. It was elegant in a terrible way. She could admit that. She picked up her apron and went back to the stove because the breakfast pots needed finishing, and the morning still required feeding 12 people, and the world did not stop its ordinary demands because someone was trying to dismantle it. Ethan found the receipt by noon. It was in a tin box at the bottom of a trunk in his office, a small square of paper dated October 1883, stamped paid in full. In February 1884, signed by the county clerk, whose name was not Harold Mercer, and had never been Harold Mercer. He brought it to the kitchen and set it on the work table beside Emily, who examined it with the focused attention of someone who has decided that this document is now the most important object in the county. This is real, she said. Of course it's real. I mean, it's going to win, she said. This receipt plus the date discrepancy in the notice, they've dated the alleged default to a period when this loan was already closed. Either someone made a significant arithmetic error, or they assumed you wouldn't have the paperwork. They assumed wrong, Ethan said. Yes, Emily said. They did. Sarah was watching this exchange from the stove, her 15-year-old daughter methodically dismantling a fraudulent legal claim against a man's ranch with the calm precision of someone doing arithmetic homework, and she felt something so complicated and so fierce move through her chest that she had to turn back to the stove so it didn't show. 3 years ago, she had been a widow with 3 children and $39. Her daughter was currently saving a ranch. By mid-afternoon, Ethan had ridden to Red Creek with Pete and the receipt and requested an urgent meeting with the county clerk. Sarah stayed at the ranch because someone had to, and because the travelers kept coming, and because Luke needed someone to tell him clearly and calmly that everything was being handled when he asked, which he did twice, with the particular taut anxiety of a boy who understood more than he was supposed to, and was trying to hold it together in the way he'd watched his mother hold things together for 3 years. Is Ethan going to lose the ranch? Luke asked. No, Sarah said. How do you know? Because he has the receipt, and the law requires actual evidence, not just paper that looks like evidence. Luke thought about this. What if the law doesn't work? She looked at her son, at the 9-year-old face asking the question that every person who has ever been on the wrong side of a powerful man's decision has asked, usually alone, usually at night. Then we go to the next step, she said. There's always a next step. What's the next step? The territorial court, a higher judge, the newspaper in Cheyenne, the people in this county who know Mercer's been operating like this for years and have been waiting for someone to make it impossible to look away. She held his gaze. There is always a next step, Luke. The people who win are the ones who know that and keep moving. Luke was quiet. Then he said, Pete says you're the toughest person he's ever met. Pete is excessively kind. He said it to Calloway when he didn't think you could hear him. She turned back to the stove. Go check on June for Pete, she said. He'll want to know she's settled before he gets back. Luke went. Ethan returned at dusk, and she knew before he came through the door that it had gone at least partially in their direction, because Pete was walking with a slightly lighter step, and Pete was not a man who performed relief. They came into this kitchen to find Sarah, Emily, and Hannah, all at the work table. Emily with the ledger. Hannah with a piece of paper on which she had, without being asked, written out a clean timeline of every relevant event since the notice was posted, because Hannah processed things by organizing them, and this was how she helped. County clerk confirmed the original loan was closed, Ethan said. He looked at Emily first, which was the right instinct, and he had it naturally. The notice was filed by a business entity that the clerk is now looking into. It doesn't appear in standard county records prior to 6 months ago. 6 months ago, Sarah said. 6 months ago is roughly when Mercer would have started thinking about you, Pete said without ceremony. The clerk is escalating it to the county judge, Ethan continued. He was not happy. I think the word is not happy. He had the look of a man who had just discovered that someone had been using his office as cover for something without asking his permission. Clerks don't like that, Agnes Holt said. Everyone in the room turned. Agnes Holt was standing in the kitchen doorway, with her hat still on and a wrapped parcel under one arm, and the expression of a woman who had ridden 8 miles to deliver something and was not going to be dramatic about the fact that she'd also just overheard the last 30 seconds of a private conversation. Agnes, Ethan said. I heard about the notice at 3 this afternoon, Agnes said. She came in, set the parcel on the table. It was a canned ham, Sarah identified by the shape, and behind it, a smaller wrapped bundle that turned out to be a jar of apple butter, and pulled out a chair with the ease of someone who had made herself at home in difficult situations for the better part of 60 years. I also heard something else, which is the reason I wrote out. Willis Mercer's clerk spent 2 hours this afternoon at the Spotted Horse drinking alone, which Willis does not do. He drinks with company, or he doesn't drink. So I had a conversation with the bartender's wife, who is my second cousin's daughter, and who has very good hearing. The kitchen was completely silent. Willis told the man next to him, a traveling livestock buyer, who will repeat nothing because he's in this county twice a year and values his commercial relationships, that he filed paperwork for Mercer that he has been regretting since Tuesday. Agnes said. He did not specify what paperwork. He didn't need to. She looked at Sarah. Willis is 24 years old, and Mercer has been his employer since he was 19. He knows where every body is buried, so to speak, because Mercer trusted him to dig the holes. But he is 24 years old, and he is not entirely the man Mercer thinks he is. You think he'll talk? Ethan said. I think, Agnes said carefully, that a young man who has been doing questionable things on behalf of a powerful employer and has just watched that employer's scheme become a public legal matter is in a very particular state of mind. I think that state of mind can go 2 directions. And I think the direction it goes depends very much on whether someone gives him a dignified path to the right one. She looked at Sarah when she said this. Sarah met her eyes. I'm not a lawyer, Sarah said. No, Agnes agreed. But you are the person this is about. And in my experience, the testimony of a young man who has decided to do the right thing lands considerably harder when the person he wronged is present and conducting herself with grace rather than vengeance. She paused. I've been watching you since the summer fair. You conducted yourself with grace when the whole town walked past your table. You conducted yourself with grace when Mercer came to your booth and said what he said. You conducted yourself with grace at the town meeting when you had every right to be something other than graceful. She picked up her hat from the table and turned it once in her hands. I think Willis will talk to you. Sarah looked at the tin box on the shelf where she kept important documents. The place she'd put Mercer's letter, the one with the number at the bottom, that was meant to look like generosity. She looked at Emily, who was already recalculating something in the ledger, and looked up when Sarah's silence went on a half-beat too long. I'll go with you, Emily said. You'll stay here, Sarah said. Mama, you'll stay here, and you'll keep doing exactly what you've been doing, because what you've been doing is what's holding this together. She held her daughter's eyes. I need you here more than I need you with me. Emily looked at her for a moment with Jacob's eyes. Then she nodded once and looked back at the ledger. Sarah went to Red Creek the next morning. She went alone, which Agnes had recommended, and Ethan had not liked, and Pete had ultimately agreed with, "A woman who comes alone comes without threat," Pete had said with the resigned wisdom of a man who understood things he'd never been able to explain in words. She left before sunrise, and she drove the wagon herself, and she thought about nothing for the first hour, except the sound of the horse on the road, and the particular quality of early morning in Wyoming, when the air was still enough that you could hear your own heartbeat if you paid attention. Willis was at the post office when she arrived. He was picking up the morning mail for Mercer's office, a task so routine that he clearly did it without thinking, and when he turned and saw Sarah Whitmore standing 6 feet away on the boardwalk, the bundle of envelopes dropped from his hand and hit the wooden planks, and neither of them moved for a moment. She bent down and picked them up. She held them out to him. He took them. "Mr. Willis," she said, "I think you already know why I'm here." He looked very young. Up close he was younger than she'd estimated, from a distance 24 Agnes had said, and up close he looked closer to 20. The particular youth of someone who has been functioning in an adult world before he was entirely ready for it, and has been performing competence while the uncertainty lived underneath. "Ma'am," he said. "I'm not here to threaten you," she said, "and I'm not here to beg. I'm here because you filed a document that has my family's name attached to it, and I believe you know it wasn't right." His throat moved. "I want to understand what happened," she said. "That's all. I want to understand what you filed and why and what it actually says. Because right now a county judge is looking at it, and your employer's name is on it, and so is an account that didn't exist 6 months ago. And the direction this goes from here is going to depend a great deal on who speaks first and what they say." Willis looked at the envelopes in his hands. He looked at the street behind her. "If I say something," he said, "I lose my position." "Probably," she agreed. "I've got a mother in Laramie. She's not well." "I know what it is to have people depending on you," Sarah said. "I know what it is to make choices you'd rather not make because the alternative is worse. I'm not asking you to ruin yourself. I'm asking you to tell the truth to a judge who is going to find it anyway, and whose estimation of you will depend entirely on whether you came forward or waited to be dragged." Willis was quiet for a very long time. A woman walked past them on the boardwalk. A man on horseback moved down the street. Red Creek conducted its morning around them with the indifferent, ordinary rhythm of a town that did not know it was sitting at the edge of something. "There are 3 other accounts," Willis said. His voice was very low. "Not just Walkers. 3 other ranchers in this county who have notices that haven't been filed yet. Mercer's been building it for 2 years. He calls in a favor. Here adjusts a record there, nothing big enough to see clearly if you're only looking at one piece. But if someone looked at all of it..." He stopped. Sarah held very still. "If someone looked at all of it," she said quietly, "what would they find?" Willis looked at her. His face had the specific, exhausted relief of someone who has been carrying a weight that was always too heavy and has just been offered a place to set it down. "They'd find," he said, "that Harold Mercer has been running this county's commercial lending relationships like his own private collection operation for the better part of a decade." The morning moved around them. Somewhere down the street someone was opening a shop. A horse nickered. A door opened and closed. "Come with me to the county clerk," Sarah said. "Right now this morning before you have time to talk yourself out of it." Willis looked down at the envelopes one more time. Then he set them on the post office ledge with the careful precision of a man putting down something he is not going to pick up again. "All right," he said. They walked to the county clerk's office together, and Sarah Whitmore did not look at the general store window as they passed it, though she knew the shape of Harold Mercer's office window 2 doors down by heart, and she kept her pace even and her chin level, and she breathed steadily, because this was not the moment to feel anything except clear. Feeling could come later. Right now, there was a next step, and she was taking it. Willis talked for 2 hours. The county clerk, a methodical man named Bernard Oakes, who had held his position for 16 years and who had the particular controlled fury of someone who takes institutional integrity, personally listened to every word with his hands flat on his desk and his expression completely neutral. The neutrality of a man who is not neutral at all, but understands that this moment requires documentation before reaction. Sarah sat in the corner of that office and said almost nothing. She had delivered Willis to the door, and she had stated her own name and her connection to the fraudulent debt notice. And then she had sat down and been still, because this was no longer her moment to drive. This was Willis's moment, and he needed space for it, and she had enough experience with fragile courage to know that the wrong word at the wrong second could shatter it. Willis laid out 3 years of it, not emotionally, not with confession or apology, at least not at first. He delivered it the way he'd been trained to deliver things, in the precise clerical manner of a young man who had learned to handle information as an instrument rather than a burden. Dates. Account numbers. The names of the 3 other ranchers who had fabricated notices waiting in Mercer's desk drawer. The mechanism of the Red Creek Commercial and Agricultural Fund, which was a real entity incorporated legitimately in 1882, but which had been used under Mercer's direction to generate pressure documents against landowners whose commercial relationships he wanted to realign. Not to actually foreclose, to frighten, to push, to create the kind of documented vulnerability that made a man more cooperative about supply contracts and pricing arrangements and council votes. Oakes wrote everything down. His pen did not stop moving. Halfway through, Willis's voice cracked once. Just once. He was describing a conversation he'd witnessed between Mercer and a rancher named Dalloway, a man Sarah didn't know, apparently operating 40 miles north, in which Mercer had made clear that the notice against Dalloway's property would go away quietly if Dalloway switched his cattle-buying arrangements to Mercer's preferred broker. Willis had been in the room because Mercer had stopped noticing he was there, which was, Willis said, the thing that had troubled him most. Not the act itself, though the act was wrong, and he'd known it was wrong. The fact that Mercer had stopped concealing it in front of him. He stopped thinking of me as a person who might object, Willis said. He thought I was just a mechanism, part of the office. Oakes looked up from his writing. And when did you decide you weren't? Willis looked at the corner where Sarah was sitting. Recently, he said. Sarah met his eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Oakes sent a rider to the territorial court in Cheyenne before noon. The rider carried a sealed document and a request for a territorial judge to review county financial records under emergency jurisdiction, a provision that existed specifically for situations in which local official channels had been compromised, and which Oakes invoked with the grim satisfaction of a man who had been maintaining the existence of that provision in his procedural manual for 16 years and had never expected to use it. By the time Sarah drove back to the Broken Horn that afternoon, the formal process had begun. It was not fast, these things were never fast, but it had begun, which was the thing that mattered, which was the distinction between a wound that was healing and one that was still open. Ethan met her in the yard before she'd climbed down from the wagon. He looked at her face and didn't ask any questions, just held the horse's bridle while she stepped down, and that one gesture, the practicality of it, the care underneath the practicality went through her chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. Willis talked, she said. Everything. Enough. The clerk is involving the territorial court. Ethan exhaled. Not dramatically, just a long, slow release of something he'd been carrying since the morning. 3 other ranchers, she said. Not just you. He had notices for 3 others. Ethan's jaw tightened. Who? Oakes is contacting them. They'll know by tomorrow. He nodded. He was still holding the horse's bridle. She was standing 2 feet from him in the yard she'd driven into for the first time 3 months ago, not knowing whether she would stay, and the evening was coming on, and the kitchen needed starting, and her children were somewhere on this property. She could hear Luke's voice from the direction of the barn, and that was enough to locate the center of her world within reasonable parameters. Sarah, Ethan said. The potatoes won't peel themselves, she said, and walked toward the kitchen. She heard him exhale behind her, something between a laugh and something more complicated, and she kept walking because she needed the stove and the familiar weight of cast iron and the specific reliable comfort of doing the next thing before she could allow herself to feel the full measure of what the day had been. The territorial judge arrived in Red Creek 12 days later. His name was Harlan Briggs, and he was 60 years old, and had the look of a man who had seen a considerable variety of human ingenuity in the service of dishonesty, and was no longer surprised by any of it, which made him, in Sarah's estimation, exactly the right person for this moment. He set up proceedings in the town hall, the same room where the council meeting had been held 2 months before, and he issued a public notice that all parties with relevant information regarding the Red Creek Commercial and Agricultural Fund were invited to present it. The notice ran in the Courier. Agnes Holt pinned a copy in the window of the dry goods store. Sarah did not attend the first day of proceedings. She had a kitchen to run, and travelers to feed, and children to keep steady, and the proceedings didn't require her presence yet. But she heard about it from Agnes, who attended as an observer with the composed attentiveness of a woman who has been watching her town clearly for decades and considers bearing witness a civic duty. 3 of the 4 ranchers named in Mercer's unserved notices had come to Red Creek. The 4th had sent a written statement. 2 of them had kept records Bill's correspondence notes from conversations that corroborated Willis's account in ways that Mercer's lawyer, a man brought up from Cheyenne, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the day progressed, could not cleanly address. Mercer sat at the front of the room. Agnes told Sarah that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that she'd poured herself without asking, because Agnes Holt had achieved the age at which a woman simply pours her own coffee. He sat very still, and he looked at the judge, and he looked at Willis, and he looked at the other ranchers, and he had the expression of a man who has operated for so long in a place where his certainty was the ceiling that he cannot quite process a room in which it isn't. "Did he say anything?" Ethan asked. "He said through his lawyer that the accounts were legitimate financial instruments that had been mischaracterized by disgruntled parties." Agnes drank her coffee. The judge looked at him over his glasses for approximately 4 seconds and then asked Willis to continue. Calloway made a sound that was not quite a laugh. 4 seconds, Pete said. "That's a verdict in 4 seconds. The formal ruling came on the 3rd day. Harold Mercer was found to have engaged in fraudulent commercial practices using an incorporated entity as a vehicle, the fabrication or misrepresentation of debt instruments against at least 4 county landowners, and the abuse of his position on the county financial board to access and alter records. The Red Creek Commercial and Agricultural Fund was dissolved. The notices against all 4 ranchers, including the one against the Broken Horn, were declared null and void. Mercer was removed from the town council and the county financial board, pending criminal review by the territorial court. A process that Agnes said with careful precision was going to take considerably longer than the civil proceedings, but was moving in a direction that would not be comfortable for Harold Mercer. Willis received a formal censure for his participation. He'd known, and he'd waited, and that had consequences. But the judge noted publicly that his voluntary testimony had been determinative, and that his cooperation had been given without inducement or guarantee, which was the judge's formal way of saying that Willis had done the right thing when he didn't have to, and that this mattered. Willis was out of a position naturally. Mercer's office had closed the same afternoon the ruling came down. The physical office simply locked the sign still hanging. The abrupt end that powerful men's operations sometimes come to, not gradually, but all at once, like a load-bearing wall giving way. Sarah heard about this through Agnes on the 4th morning, and she thought about Willis for a moment, the young man who had set down a stack of envelopes on a post office ledge and walked away from them, and she made a decision that she had been turning over quietly for 2 days. She sent him a note. It said, "I have accounts that need managing, and a supply operation that has outgrown one person's oversight. The position pays honest wages. If you want it, come on Thursday." He came on Thursday. He came with a leather satchel and the careful manner of a man who has recently learned something important about himself and is still getting used to the knowledge. He sat down at the kitchen table across from Emily, who regarded him for approximately 15 seconds with the concentrated assessment of someone running a calculation, and then said, "The southeast column in the cooperative ledger doesn't reconcile. Can you find it?" Willis looked at the ledger. He found it in 4 minutes. Emily said, "You start Monday." Sarah at the stove said nothing, but she was smiling. The summer fair came again 3 weeks later. Red Creek had its annual fair in the last week of August, and this year the preparations had a quality that Sarah couldn't quite name until Emily named it for her relief. The town had the quality of a place that had been holding its breath for a long time and had recently been permitted to exhale. She heard it in the way people talked at the supply store, in the way the conversations at the fair were easier and louder and more real than the careful, performative version she'd observed the year before. Her booth was in the center of the fairgrounds this time. Agnes had arranged it not with fanfare, not as a statement, just as the natural consequence of someone knowing who belonged where. The line formed before she'd finished setting up, not a polite, tentative line. A real one, people who had come specifically, who had told other people, some of whom had come from the next county and the county after that, because word of what Sarah Whitmore cooked had traveled the way. Genuine things travel not through advertisement, but through the mouths of people who had eaten and could not stop talking about it. Mrs. Tillman was the third person in line. Sarah saw her coming and felt the old reflex, the brace, the preparation, and then felt it dissolve, because Mrs. Tillman was not wearing the expression she'd worn outside the general store when Hannah had overheard her. She was wearing the expression of a woman who had something to say and had decided to say it. "I'll take 2 of the apple cinnamon," Mrs. Tillman said. She put her money on the table. Then she said, without meeting Sarah's eyes directly, "I said something last spring that wasn't fair. I want you to know I know that." It was not a grand apology. It was a small, uncomfortable, real one, the kind that costs something and means exactly what it is and nothing more. 2 apple cinnamon, Sarah said. She wrapped them herself, handed them over. "Enjoy the fair, Mrs. Tillman." Mrs. Tillman took them and walked away, and Sarah turned to the next person in line and did not assign the moment more or less weight than it deserved, because she had learned, was still learning, that closure didn't always look like resolution. Sometimes it looked like a woman buying 2 pies and saying 11 words badly, and both of you moving forward anyway. By mid-morning, she'd sold out of cinnamon rolls entirely. Hannah came back from the supply run with her eyes wide. "They're asking at the hotel in Milford County if you'd be interested in a standing weekly order," she said. "A man gave me this." She held out a card. "A hotel, a real one, 40 miles east with a restaurant operation." Sarah looked at the card. "Tell him to write me a letter with the specifics," she said. Hannah grinned a full, unguarded grin, the kind she hadn't worn for the better part of 3 years, and went back into the crowd. Luke had appointed himself the line manager, a role he'd invented that morning, and which consisted primarily of telling people where to stand, and occasionally reporting to Sarah on conditions at the back of the line, with the grave authority of a 9-year-old who has decided this is his job. He was currently in conversation with Pete at the rear of the line, both of them assessing the crowd with the same evaluative squint, and Sarah watched them for a moment and let herself feel what she felt. Late afternoon, when the crowd had finally thinned enough that she could breathe, Ethan came to the booth. Not to buy, he'd been at the fairgrounds all day, moving through the crowd, with the quiet steadiness that was simply how he moved through the world, and he came to the booth. Now, the way he'd done everything with her, without performance, without announcement, just present. He leaned against the front edge of the table, the same way he'd leaned against it the year before, when he'd been a stranger, and she'd been a woman, deciding whether hope was something she could still afford. "You're out of cinnamon rolls," he said. "Sold out by 9. "I know. I was watching the line from the east gate." He paused. "You've had people from 4 counties. Hannah counted. Of course she did." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fairgrounds, at Luke and Pete still running the self-appointed rear operation, at Emily and Willis at the edge of the grounds, going over something in a small notebook with the focused energy of 2 people who have discovered they are well matched at the same kind of work. At Hannah sitting on the edge of the water trough, talking to a girl her age, with the easy comfort of someone who has stopped bracing for the world and started living in it. "Last year," Ethan said, "you were standing at a table that the whole town had walked past, and you were deciding whether to keep going." "I remember," Sarah said. "I almost didn't stop." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said true things. "I'd been at the fair for an hour, and I was heading to my horse. I walked past your booth twice before I stopped." She looked at him. "What made you stop the second time?" she asked. I was quiet for a moment, the genuine pause of a man not constructing an answer, but finding it. "Luke dropped something," he said. "A piece of paper. It blew against my boot. I bent down to pick it up, and when I stood up, I was standing right in front of your table, and you were looking at me." He paused. "You weren't asking for anything. You weren't performing hope or desperation or any of the things a person in your position had every right to be feeling. You were just looking, like you'd been looking at this world for a long time, and you were still willing to see it clearly." Sarah was very still. "I bought the cinnamon roll," he said, "because I wanted to taste what a person like that makes." She looked at her hands on the table, the same hands that had been flat on this same kind of surface a year ago, with $39 and a decision to make. "Ethan," she said. "Sarah, I'm going to accept that hotel order," she said. "Emily thinks we can manage a standing supply arrangement with 3 or 4 operations in adjacent counties if we formalize the production. She's drawn up a structure." "Of course she has," he said. "It would mean expanding the kitchen operation at the ranch. Hiring 2 or 3 women. I've already identified 3 who need the work. A widow in Milford whose husband died this spring. A woman named Clara who was let go from the hotel laundry when she refused the managers." She stopped. "People who need something real." "Do it," he said. "You haven't heard the cost." "Emily will have made sure the numbers work," he said. "I trust Emily's numbers. You should. They're better than yours. They're better than most people's." He was looking at her with the expression she'd been cataloging for 3 months, the one she'd been refusing to name because naming it meant deciding what to do with it. "Sarah." "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you haven't said." He let that sit between them for a moment. "I'm not a man who moves fast," he said. "I reckon you know that by now." "I know it, and you're not a woman who makes decisions she hasn't thought through." "No, so I'm not going to say anything tonight that requires an answer tonight," he said. "But I want you to know." He stopped. He looked at the fairgrounds again, at all of it, at the whole improbable living thing that had grown out of a cinnamon roll and a 10-cent tip, and a woman who had refused to look down. "I want you to know that the day I stopped at your table was the best decision I have made in my adult life. Not because of what it did for the ranch. Not because of the cooking. Though the cooking is extraordinary. Because of who you are. Because of who those children are. Because of what it is to come home to a place that is actually a home." Sarah looked at the empty tray where the cinnamon rolls had been. She thought about Jacob, which she still did, which she expected she always would, the way you keep a room in yourself for someone who mattered, not locked just there. She thought about the morning 3 years ago when everything she'd known had changed in an instant, and the years since that had been about survival so consistently that she'd stopped being able to feel the difference between enduring and living. She looked at her children. At the ranch hands she'd fed through a winter and a summer. At Agnes Holt, who was on the other side of the fairgrounds, talking to the county clerk with the air of someone who is already organizing whatever comes next. At Willis, who had set down a stack of envelopes and walked toward something better than what he'd been. She looked at Ethan Walker, who had bent down to pick up a piece of paper that a 9-year-old had dropped, and in doing so had accidentally stood in the exact right place at the exact right moment, and chosen deliberately, unhurriedly, with his whole self to stop. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It was not a declaration of love. It was something more specific than that, more particular, more earned. It was the statement of a woman who had weighed everything and made her decision, and would not be moved from it, which was for a woman like Sarah Whitmore, the deepest form of yes she knew how to give. Ethan nodded. He straightened up from the table. "I'll bring the wagon around at 6, he said. "I'll be ready," she said. They married in October in the yard of the Broken Horn Ranch, with Pete Dawson standing as witness, and Agnes Holt organizing the food, because she had very specific opinions about how it should be done, and nobody had the energy to disagree with her, and the 3 other ranchers. Mercer had tried to ruin all, came and ate and laughed with the particular released quality of men who have been through something together and come out the other side intact. Luke stood between Pete and Ethan during the ceremony, with the serious composure of a boy who considers this arrangement not just acceptable, but correct, which he had communicated to Ethan 3 weeks prior in a private conversation that Pete had overheard and reported to Sarah in a voice that was very careful and neutral, and betrayed absolutely nothing except that Pete Dawson was a man with a great deal of feeling underneath a small amount of available vocabulary. Emily and Willis formalized the supply operation in November. By spring, it served 6 hotel kitchens and a regional mercantile. Hannah's baking had become by the quiet consensus of everyone who had tasted it, something beyond instruction, a talent that was hers entirely grown in the corner of a kitchen, where she'd sat with her book and her stillness and her father's watching eyes. And the Broken Horn Ranch became the kind of place that people talked about not for its size or its wealth or any single spectacular thing, but for the quality of what it was. A place where the food was extraordinary and the people were real, and where no one, not one single person who came through that door, was judged by anything except the content of their character and the honesty of their hunger. A woman who had stood at an empty table with $39 and 3 children and a world that had decided to walk past her had simply refused to accept that decision as final. She had kept cooking. She had kept showing up. And in the end, that was the whole of it, the complete and sufficient and undefeatable truth that Sarah Whitmore had known all along, and that Red Creek, Wyoming had finally learned to see. The ones who keep showing up are the ones who change everything.